Okay, the next talk up is Dr. David Kring talking about the utility of a small pressurized rover with Suitports for lunar exploration, a geologist perspective.
Thank you, Kelsey. Okay. I'm going to be speaking about this lunar electric rover, and this is something that we utilized in several mission simulations, actually now several years ago. And in the second slide, I'll explain why I'm talking about these mission simulations from the past now. But during these mission simulations, I served as a traverse planner and a science lead, and all of my co-authors here got to implement those plans. They were crew. And so the experience that I'm going to be telling you about today comes from all of our activities. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so why am I talking about the LER? The reason is there is a new ISEG design reference mission that involves this vehicle called the Gateway that'll be in orbit around the moon, and it will be coordinating activities with crew on the lunar surface in this mission scenario. If I can have the next slide. And the plan is to put 2 of these rovers down on the lunar surface and then land crew. The crew conduct a mission of a certain duration, come back with samples. The LER then drive to a second landing site. Crew then land at that second landing site, conduct another mission. So there's going to be a series of 5 missions in this architecture. Next slide. In this DRM, the landing sites that have been identified are Malapert Massif, which is on the near side, followed by the South Pole, Schrödinger Basin, Antoniadi Crater, and the South Pole Aitken Basin. So the 2 LER land here, crew meet with them, they conduct a mission, crew come home, and then telerobotically the LER is driven to the next site, and this continues for a period of 5 years. Next slide. Okay, so before I talk about the LER itself, I do want to point out that through survey, we supported a graduate student study. There's 4 abstracts that took a look at this traverse between all the landing sites. It is a feasible traverse for the LER, and if you are more interested in the traverse itself, I recommend you go chase down those abstracts. Next slide. But what I want to talk about today is this LER and the functionality of the Suitports, which was a new concept for this vehicle. I want to point out that when Constellation was operating, the first rover that was built is an unpressurized rover that was called Chariot that we tested in 2008. Later in that same year, we compared the Chariot's capabilities with this version with a cabin, which is mimicking a small pressurized rover, and you can see it has these 2 Suitports. There was a designed trade study with 1-day and 3-day missions to determine which of these 2 vehicles was the most effective. And from a geological point of view, this one hands down. The crew were far more productive when they got to stations, in part because they weren't so fatigued. If I can have the next slide, please. Okay, so after that, we also did a 14-day mission simulation in 2009, and then a dual rover 28-day mission in 2010. And both of these longer duration missions used the small pressurized version of the vehicle with these Suitports because that seemed to be the optimum configuration. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you go to the LPI website and you're looking for more information about the SPR, you'll find this type of image, and it talks about some of the engineering that went into this vehicle. I'm going to focus all of our attention on the rest of the day on the Suitports and what crew can do, both IVA, that is from inside the vehicle, and then EVA once they go out this Suitport. Next slide. So to introduce the capabilities of the vehicle, I have this little slide here. There's a geologic tool rack, which is similar to the one that was on the LRV during the last 3 Apollo missions. There is this wonderful front end of the vehicle with grand views of the terrain, and the vehicle is outfitted with a number of cameras. And so from within the vehicle, you can actually utilize these high visibility windows, a fore-cam, an aft-cam, port and starboard cameras, and there's also docking cameras and a gigapan. So from within the vehicle, crew could describe and photo document distant features, that's important, during drives between stations, as well as they were approaching a station, viewing the near field and assist in EVA planning before they actually came to a stop. And that was actually very useful. They'd make observations, they would report back to the science ops group, and we would adjust the pre-mission EVA plan as necessary. Next slide. They could then go EVA through these suit ports. And the advantages of these suit ports is largely that you can get out of the vehicle and vice versa, get back into the vehicle very quickly in about 10 minutes. Okay, so to reduce the timeline, mass, and volumetric overhead, rapid egress and ingress were envisioned. That meant instead of having an airlock on a pressurized vehicle, the cabin pressure on this design would be lower. It would be reduced to something called to 8 psi as opposed to the 14.7 psi that currently is used on the International Space Station, which reduces dramatically the time to get out of the vehicle. And of course, then they would use these suit ports on this aft cabin wall to do that. That allowed crew typically to do 3 to 4 EVA stations per day and 2 to 3 hours per day of boots on the ground. If instead you had a relatively high pressure vehicle with an airlock, you might, if you were lucky, get 1 EVA per day. Next slide. Okay, so this allowed crew to explore far larger territory with complex geological and ISRU features than would a single longer duration EVA at any one location, while also minimizing crew time in a spacesuit. And if you want to bend Jack's ear, he'll tell you about how brutal spacesuits can be. This significantly reduced crew fatigue and enhanced productivity at each station. Next slide. Now, we did these mission simulations in close coordination with the Human Research Program. And so I'm going to show you 3 slides from Jason Norcross, who wrote this up in 2014. This is a plot of EVA time for both the unpressurized Chariot version of the vehicle and the small pressurized LER version of the vehicle. And you can see that they spent much less time EVA, but their performance or productivity during that, from that same vehicle was much greater. Next slide. This is again comparing the UPR, the unpressurized with the pressurized performance as a function of EVA hour. This is what 2 crews were able to do in the Chariot vehicle in terms of performance per EVA hour, and you can see that the performance went way up in 1 day, 2 day, and 3 on the first, second, and third day of a 3-day mission. Next slide. Summarizing that, the Human Research Program pointed out that the productivity increased by 57%. There was a 470% increase in productivity per EVA hour, while crew fatigue was statistically significantly lower. So the answer seemed to be, after this exercise, that you wanted to put crew in a pressurized rover with suit ports as opposed to a vehicle without a pressurized volume or with an airlock. Next slide. Okay, now that's a wonderful way to look at that, but since I'm speaking after Jack Schmidt, I said, well, let's see what we can do if we're actually going to try to simulate with this vehicle or a vehicle with an airlock the Apollo 17 mission. So this is a slide that should look familiar because you just saw something similar a moment ago. Here's South Massif, the Lee Lincoln Scarp, Sculptured Hills, the North Massif here. Here's where the LEM landed. And next slide. Here is EVA2 and EVA3 and the different stations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the EVA3 out here through 6 through 9. Next slide. So to put some numbers on this, EVA2 was about an 18-kilometer loop, which they did in about 7.5 hours. EVA3 was a 10-kilometer loop done in a similar amount of time. Both of these were accomplished in an LRV, which is an unpressurized vehicle, okay? But what would happen if we flew a pressurized vehicle? Next slide. The multiple stations of EVA 2 and 3 would not be possible in a small pressurized rover if crew were limited to a single EVA per day, okay? So just looking at this without cranking any numbers, the initial assessment would be if an airlock configuration on SPR limits crew to a single EVA, then future missions would not be able to accomplish what Jack and Jean did with on the Apollo 17 mission. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a closer look at this. So while crew could potentially walk between stations spaced relatively close together, crew could not walk the entire distance of either EVA2 and EVA3, okay? Much less carry the tools and samples over those distances. Next slide. Crew would also have to walk back to the vehicle after going EVA. If you have an airlock and you can only do one EVA today, that would then double their walking distance unless the rover was teleoperated from Earth or from lunar orbit and driven on a path that trailed the walking crew. This kind of is an absurd thing. You have two people outside working really hard and the rover is trailing behind them. It just seems a little bit silly to me. Not very efficient use of hardware. Next slide, please. So a single EVA per day scenario would effectively limit crew to a single station. Crew would not be able to explore complex geologic terrains with the same fidelity as Apollo crew, nor as efficiently. Next slide. So Suitports, on the other hand, would provide multiple EVA per day capability, so they could do this same EVA within the comfort, largely within the comfort of a small pressurized rover. Next slide. Okay, so the conclusion, using Apollo 17 landing site as a trade scenario, if one utilizes an SPR, such as the Lunar Electric Rover, to extend traverse distances beyond the 10-kilometer walk-back distance, and that's the goal. The goal with these LERs, and the goal of flying two of them simultaneously, is to put a crew of 4 on the ground that then can explore a zone of 100 kilometers, okay? Which is greatly beyond the 10-kilometer walk-back distance, okay? So then it needs to have a rapid egress-ingress capability, such as Suitports, to match and potentially exceed the capabilities of Apollo crew and LRV. Next slide. Okay, so these first couple of bullets are what I just said on the previous slide. So let me just close with this last bullet. When a future crew is involved in long-duration traverses on the lunar surface, the deployment of a vehicle with Suitports may be a better solution than a higher pressure vehicle with an airlock. Thank you.
You showed numbers where the time available for EVA would go down significantly, but the efficiency would go up so much that it would more than compensate. And I'm wondering, those numbers are for 1G. Is that going to hold for 1/6 G?
We have no reason to think that it wouldn't. So the issue is, if you are in the spacesuit the entire time, it is incredibly fatiguing. Even if you're in 1/6 G, all of the Apollo astronauts came home and said the suits were kind of brutal. They used some other colorful language at times. But you generally want to keep the crew out of those suits as much as possible. And within the comfort of the vehicle, you can do a tremendous amount of geology. So we did another type of trade study, and that is what could you do within the vehicle, just IVA, as they say. And in certain areas, you can do 90% of the geology from within the vehicle that you could do on Earth in shirt sleeve. And so you can, what you want to do is within the comfort of the vehicle is do as much as possible, but then when you do need to get out, take a closer look at the rock or to collect the rocks, select the rocks, then you want to spend your time outside the vehicle in that spacesuit.
I have a question here. What is the thinking about the relatively lesser oxygen availability to the lungs of the explorers in a much lower PSI environment? Is this thought to be manageable with a higher relative proportion of oxygen in the mix, or personal breathing gear that they would wear in transit?
Okay, so that's a biomedical question that I'm not really comfortable answering, but I can tell you that we were doing this with biomedical staff and HRP staff for the specific purpose of investigating this scenario, which at least at that time they thought was reasonable and concluded was feasible.
Okay,
But
thank you.
the details, the biomedical details, I would refer you to the biomedical staff.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have to move on, sorry. Please, hold on to those thoughts because we got a discussion session coming up and I would like to, well, David, think about that for the discussion.